All right, today we're here with John Wagner, a good friend of mine. Known you for, I don't know, a dozen years, I guess.
About that.
About that. Does a lot of very interesting things. So we're going to get into talking about some of those today. So welcome.
Glad to help.
Well, I'm glad you're here. One of the things that we're hoping to be able to do is to show that there's these ethical principles that are somewhat universal that people can follow and stuff. And I know that with the work that you do with the Secular Coalition for America in New York, there are definitely daily issues at the State House that come up that you're dealing with and trying to promote. Out of the last few years, you've been doing it for what, 4 or 5 years?
A little more than that now.
What's been the biggest fight that you've had so far since you've been working on these issues?
Oh, I don't know if anyone is really bigger than another, but in terms of importance, I think one of the really significant areas that New York has finally addressed recently is passing the last of the 10 points of the Women's Equality Agenda, essentially guaranteeing the right of women to reproductive control over their life. Because of the movement essentially driven by many more religious people to restrict Roe v. Wade and restrict the ability of women and physicians to honestly discuss and make decisions about a woman's reproductive health. There was a lot of fear in New York that Roe v. Wade might be overturned, and if so, New York would revert to its old law, which was passed well before Roe v. Wade. And so finally, in the last legislature, there was a series of provisions that were put into New York state law that essentially protect a woman's right to choose and her reproductive freedom. One of the more significant ones was taking the possible penalty for performing an abortion out of criminal law and putting it into civil law, for example. But essentially now it gives the woman and her physician and her advisors the right to make a choice about her reproductive
So it only took 40 years for the state of New York to get around to doing it.
Well, it wasn't very important for a long time. As long as Roe v. Wade was governing what was happening in New York, everything was fine. But there still are certain issues in New York that we continue to be concerned with. When health care is delivered through hospitals, and some of those hospitals have a religious viewpoint, sometimes that religious viewpoint can impinge on a woman's choice to make a decision. So there are examples of where a hospital, for example, will refuse to perform a vasectomy or a sterilization procedure because it's against the religion of that particular faith, most frequently in New York, the Catholic faith. But those are still ongoing issues. But in terms of the legal system now, things are at a place where I'd like to see them. So that's an issue that has now receded. Another area that we're really interested in right now that is an ongoing battle is the ability of a person to make decisions about the end of life. So currently the Secular Coalition has an ongoing coalition effort with Compassion and Choice and other groups. And one of the things that they're trying to do is give a person who is diagnosed at the end of their life the right to end it humanely. Essentially, there are a series of provisions that are in place to make sure that the individual's rights are protected. But if a person is clearly near the end of their life, they would like to end their life, and they're judged by physicians to be of sound mind, there is a desire of a lot of people to be able to essentially have a physician's help in ending their life peacefully.
Is that
that doesn't exist in New York right now,
yeah.
But we're working to get it passed. It's been passed in a number of different states, in Oregon and California and DC, I think 8 right now. And we'd like to extend that thing to New York. Mm-hmm. One of the more interesting experiences I had in trying to pass this law was actually up at the New York State Fair in Syracuse, which is a great place to go. You can meet all kinds of people and have a great time. But we, along with Compassion and Choice, we set up a table in one of the industrial buildings. Where there are lots of people pitching different ideas, some political, some educational. But we talked to people and tried to get signatures promoting the idea of compassion and choice, that people should have the right to control the end of their lives. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was that by after being there for 3 or 4 hours, I could start sort of classifying people's responses. Some people would listen, they'd be open, they'd want to understand. Some people had had an experience with somebody who had a very difficult death, who appreciated the difficulties, who wanted to talk about it, and how a law could be managed and changed in New York, and where they were often very supportive. I talked to a lot of healthcare professionals who, again, had immediate experience, who were interested and generally supportive. But then one of the groups that I often ran into were people who were religious who said, oh no, I can't even talk about that. I'm not allowed to even think about that. That's wrong. God doesn't want people to take their own life. So it's this sort of inability to discuss things and to interact and talk about how laws should be put in place to satisfy human values. That is one of the really important aspects of humanism that is often lacking in people who are overly religious.
So just having that opportunity to discuss it and be open for a discussion and have that back and forth, that's a key aspect of being human anywhere.
Yeah, but it's something that's not allowed to some people, or at least they don't see it as something that's permissible from their religion. They don't even want to discuss it.
Yeah.
And it was really fairly remarkable.
So you could have a corn dog and talk about the end of life. And depending on the corn dog, it might end your life. So in Albany, have you, what have been the obstacles that you've had in terms of these different issues that have come up that you would say, I need more help?
I think every citizen, I think, has a responsibility to do something to further the public good. And so I think every human should be political to some extent. So yeah, of course, voting is the first thing, and that's the thing that I always try to encourage people to do. I pass out voter registration cards to all the graduate students who come into my class every year. So in case anybody wants to vote in New York, they have an easy pathway to do it. At a more local and personal level, getting to know who your representatives and senators are. In the city of New York, it's an unusual system in that New York is full of political clubs. And so joining a local political club gives you access to other people who are interested and knowledgeable about politics, who are engaged. It gives you a chance to talk to representatives, especially at the state level. So if I, for example, belong to the Four Freedoms Democratic Club and I'm on the board there, and that club creates events where you can talk to knowledgeable people, you can talk to your state senator, your state assembly person. Very frequently, the representative Carolyn Maloney, who's our local representative, will come and talk about what's going on. Getting to know those people in person and talking to them about your issues is something that you can do that's really straightforward. Indeed, most people who are interested in government and who are officials want to know what their constituents are interested in and what they care about. So that's the first thing I tell people to do, is get involved in politics. In terms of humanism, I think one of the things you want to look for are local humanist and free-thinking groups where you can talk about politics and political issues. I think it's important for people to get involved in a local humanist group, for example, the Ethical Culture Society, which is where we're sitting right now, talks about issues that have political implications and the way government should work. The Secular Humanist Society of New York is another. At a more national level, the Secular Coalition, which has a venue both at a national level and in many of the states. The American Humanist Association is also becoming more politically involved, and they actually have a group called the Committee for Free Thought Equality. So seeking out those specialized groups and parts of humanist organizations and getting what advice you can get from them is really very useful. For example, the Committee for Free Thought Equality has an associated political action committee. And one of the things that they do is screen candidates and ask them questions that are of interest to people whose values are really secular. So they can identify people who have values that are typically secular and consistent with humanist principles.
Do they put those on the website?
And those are on the website, and they're easy enough to find if you just Google Committee for Free Thought Equality. Mm-hmm. And you can look for people who are recommended, and there are also a discussion of issues. Likewise, the Secular Coalition has a booklet that talks about important principles and how they are expressed in government and government policy. And so you can get those booklets or read them online.
So what are those main principles? Do you remember off the top of your head?
Well, it's a lot of them derive from basic humanist ideas.
Yeah.
The basic idea of humanism is that people can have a life stance and an ethical viewpoint that really derives from the values of humanity, of other human beings. Every human being sees things that are certainly important and valuable. And if you really reason from that basic principle towards how people should behave, you can start to deduce how laws should be shaped and governed. So for example, humanists in general believe that people should have a freedom to have a religion if they wish to. They shouldn't be forced into one religious practice or another, or they should have a freedom to have no religion at all, which is something that I know you and I share in not having.
Yes, exactly.
There's a value in communication and free speech, that people should be able to debate and express their opinions and talk freely. So there is a promotion of any aspect that will allow free speech. There also tends to be a reliance on science and logic, in the sense that since we're not dependent on any kind of revealed knowledge or principles that are presumably enunciated by one God or another, we have to go someplace, so we have to do it on the basis of observation and testing and trying to understand how policies work.
We have to figure it out ourselves, right?
We pretty much have to figure it out ourselves. And essentially, there's a lot of similarity between politics and science, in that you just have to discuss and try to come up with the best idea and test it out, and if it works, move on, and if it doesn't, try to find something better. And that's the way science works, and in a sense that's the way politics works too. And there's an evolution in both. There are constantly changes in ideas and improvements in ethical standards. I found it interesting this week that the Methodists, for example, are having a debate about whether they should allow people who are homosexuals to be ministers, and whether they should allow marriage equality.
Well, they're talking
and
about
essentially,
a split,
there's
right?
a split in that religious group. And that split is really dependent on, for those people, what they believe is the revealed dogma. On the other hand, when humanists talk about that, they usually think in terms of human potential and what is the policy that best serves human potential. So to a large extent, humanists come down on the idea that there shouldn't be a discrimination against homosexuals, that if people want to marry somebody of the same sex and have a long-term relationship, that's fine, as long as that doesn't interfere with anyone else, because that's the way to really serve human potential and enrich society. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, that's I think that those are key aspects of humanist principles that maybe not a lot of people understand on a day-to-day basis, and saying that, oh, it's about our human potential and what we can do. So those are awesome points that you make about humanism. And I also wanted to get back a little bit more about the state, because it's an election year. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of things are coming up. What are the things that you're most worried about coming up in this election cycle that's coming up in the next 8 months?
The things I'm most worried about are probably things more at a national than a local level. Mm-hmm. I think that unfortunately there has been a lack of appreciation of the value of separation of church and state at a national level. And so there's been a major effort on the basis of many religious conservatives to influence politics. One of the most recent thing that happened is that our current president decided he wanted to take measures to protect prayer in schools. He's also threatened to eliminate the Johnson Amendment, which essentially means that people who are religious, who have a church, can collect and spend money freely. So essentially it would make every church in America a political action committee that was governed essentially by the ministers and people who ran that church. That kind of thing is truly dangerous, and it's dangerous not only to the state and to people who are humanists, but it's also dangerous, I think, to the churches, in that it takes them away from their fundamental role in education and ethical teaching, and makes them into political creatures. So I really do worry a lot about the Johnson Amendment. Another thing that I worry about is the effort to take state tax money and give it to churches for religious education. Again, I think that there is a place for the state to provide services to all children, things like busing, for example, but the idea that there should be an effort to take federal dollars and give them to religious schools, I think is really, really misplaced. Again, for a lot of different reasons. One, I personally don't want to be put in a position where my tax dollars are used to teach a religious faith I don't agree in, so it's something I don't like. I think it's also dangerous in that it essentially creates an entanglement between the church and the state, where once the church is giving money to, or getting money from a government, then they have to start following government policies. And I think it's much better for those things to be kept separate. And another one comes back to something we talked about in New York, the effort, again, by political parties driven by the religious right to restrict abortion and access to abortion. It's something that has gained a lot of momentum recently, and I'm truly, truly worried about that. So there are a series of things that, from a personal point of view and sort of my humanistic ethics, I'm concerned about at a national level in the next election. Indeed, one of the things that we worked on in the state for a while was, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, there was an effort by the state to create a state office to facilitate religious interactions with state agencies, which I thought was inappropriate, and eventually it fell by the wayside. There was also a bill that was put in place that would have created a tax credit for people who gave money to a private or religious schools. Again, that's an issue where, by an indirect and more complicated method, people were taking money away from state taxes and giving it to a church. And I'm sure that that's something that is going to rear its ugly head again in this election.
Well, I think overall, you're looking at the aspects that religion wants to have an exception to the rule that everybody has to follow, a religious exception for, let's say, having vaccinations. That's been big in the news this last year here in New York because we had an outbreak of measles, and whether it's the religious freedom to spend money the way that they want to spend money, religious freedom that they want to be able to discriminate against other people and stuff. I think that you said it very eloquently, is like that we as humans are wanting to do it for human potential, and I think that that's where we can see that there's a difference in terms of the basic ethics of religion versus humanism, and that humanism is a particular viewpoint that we're talking about everybody. It's egalitarian, it's about people's potential instead of being all these exceptions. And you've seen this over and over again all the time, that religion's trying to get an exception for this, get an exception for that, get an exception because to do that.
Yeah, I can't just disagree with you. Indeed, that's something that is ongoing, as you said. The vaccination law that was being fought out right now in our sister state in New Jersey was put on a back burner because of opposition from people who claimed religious freedom not to vaccinate their children. Within New York, the Secular Coalition, indeed, I was one of the people who spearheaded the effort, worked to try to change New York's vaccination laws. Because up until recently, there were 2 reasons that you would not vaccinate your children. One was a medical reason, which makes perfect sense. Some kids have an immunological disorder, so they really can't be properly vaccinated. But the other one was to claim in a religious exemption. And sadly, that religious exemption was often misused by people who simply just didn't believe in vaccination, who then claimed that special privilege on the basis of religion. New York did pass that law last year, and I thought, this is good, I can move on to something else. But now there's a huge blowback, and there's an attempt to repeal the change in the law. So we still work with a number of other groups in order to try to keep the law the way it is. There's a really wonderful group called Nurses Who Vaccinate that's active in New York, for example. who really teach and explain the value of vaccines, which is really grounded in science and rational thought. It's a discovery that we didn't know vaccination a couple of hundred years ago, but now it's had really remarkable effects on measles and whooping coughs. It was about a year to 2 years ago where there's an outbreak of whooping coughs in Brooklyn that was largely in a religious community. And one of the things that I found really amazing is I had never heard of a case of whooping coughs during my adult life. And I started asking physicians at Weill Cornell Med, have you seen a case of whooping coughs? Most of them had never even seen it. But all of a sudden, because a religious community decided that vaccination was inappropriate, there was an outbreak of whooping coughs. And
so they had to go get a book out, and it was like, what is a whooping cough? I haven't seen it, had to figure it out. So I had to go and pull it and figure it out.
No, that's true. And it's really sad since once you get involved in this area, because you start following medical reports and you see instances where a large number of children have died because of measles, for example, in the last year, cases of measles that could have been prevented. And I think it's an example of sort of a misapplication of science, a lack of understanding, a lack of communication, the humanist values of trying to make decisions on the basis of scientific principles and trying to educate people didn't really save the day for a lot of people.
And it's more than just the scientific information. It is actually a humanistic value to say that we're valuing everyone and that there's an equal application to that for everyone, and that science is how we do it, but the real value is we're valuing everybody in terms of what their potential is and how they can do that. So we see these religious exceptions being not only on a state level, but on the federal government, internationally and stuff. But you also have are doing quite a bit of work at the United Nations. And there are lots of groups and organizations at the UN that are trying to promote their particular values, but we also have a lot of religious organizations and big, huge countries that have a large religious population. How does a humanist in those countries say that I'm fighting an uphill battle with people in my own community to have the right to fight for science, to fight for this egalitarian, I believe in the potential for everyone, but they're fighting these big battles.
Oh, yeah, it's a hard question to answer because there's so many countries and so many battles that are fought in different countries. But the UN is a really interesting organization where so many of those groups come together to talk about it. And the UN is not an easily understood organization. It's very bureaucratic and very complicated. But it is composed both of state players and it's composed of what they call non-governmental organizations. For the humanists, there are a number of different non-governmental organizations that have status, which means that they are accepted to work with the United Nations. They go to form committees and they will give advice if it's solicited and try to influence countries at the level of the United Nations by making declarations or investigating certain situations. So I was asked by Humanist International to represent them at the United Nations in New York. And Humanist International is actually based out of London, and it's kind of an umbrella organization that actually tries to provide expertise and knowledge around the world to other humanist organizations. So for example, in the United States, the American Humanist Association is a member of Humanist International. But there are chapters that are essentially in every continent in the United States. So you can go to Africa or India or China and find humanist chapters. And those humanist chapters are chapters that can receive resources and educational material from Humanist International. The different chapters have meetings that occur every other year to get together to talk about ongoing issues and try to hammer out common positions that we will understand. At the United Nations, a lot of the efforts of the humanists are based on trying to support the different provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the UDHR, as it's sometimes called, is really based on the 4 freedoms that FDR enunciated at the end of World War II. And I think there are 22 different points in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they're really sort of divided into 2 big sets. There's one that are human rights that are very familiar to people in the United States, that are really sort of political and civil rights. But there's another set of rights that are more economics and social rights that have to do with the right to be able to have adequate health care or to be able to support a family. So those things are not often considered rights in the United States, but all those are really things that, from the point of view of, I think, most humanists, are things that will make society better. If people have adequate medical care and have an adequate opportunity to earn an income and to support their children, that's something that's really of value. The 2 things that I'm most interested in are in Articles 18 and 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Article 18 is a right to religious freedom, and Article 19 is most simply a right to freedom of speech and freedom to hold and enunciate an opinion. And those two rights, it turns out, are really difficult to distinguish because if you have a right to express your opinion, in some senses you have a religious right, because you can say what you think about a particular religion or the truth about ethics or the way the world works. But we try to defend those and try to make alliances so that everybody can enjoy those human rights. And it's really interesting to see that the different groups that come together often form very strong coalitions. Although they may disagree about the religious viewpoint, when they sit down, everybody would like to see a freedom of religion, or the majority of people would like to see a freedom of religion. There are exceptions to that, and there are disputes that are interesting and important and worth thinking about and trying to understand. For example, there are a number of countries that have laws against blasphemy or apostasy. And of course, blasphemy simply means insulting or denying or refuting another person's beliefs. Apostasy, on the other hand, is just the right to change religion. So if one has freedom of speech and freedom of opinion, you should be able to have the freedom to change your opinion. And if you change your opinion about religion, you should be able to change from one religion to another. Yet in some states, there's a penalty for switching religions or denying a religion or insulting a religion that can range from being thrown in jail to huge fines to even a death penalty. And so one of the things that Humanist International and I and many of the people at the Committee for Freedom of Religion and Belief at the UN works towards is trying to make changes in laws to promote freedom of religion and freedom of expression. And
well, you have this balance between what people can say about I want everybody to be able to say what they want to say, and they want to be able to express themselves in whatever way they want. But then there's inflammatory, there's outright lying, there's making stuff up, there's fake news, there's all these things that happen, and most people are against that. So as a humanist, how do we sit there and say, okay, I want these freedoms, but I also don't really like all this crap that comes with it.
Yeah. This is one of the things where I think we're at a situation where we don't really know what the future holds and how we should really be thinking about this. Within the United States, for example, the freedom of speech and opinion is held at such a high level that the classic American will say, well, the best way to defend free speech is more speech. The best way to compete with hate speech is more speech. But on the other hand, not every country holds that viewpoint. Europeans have a very different viewpoint in that there are a number of European countries that have outlawed particular types of speech that they classify as hate speech. The UN is actually currently crafting, and it's not complete yet, basically a UN policy on hate speech. And it's very clear from the discussions there isn't any really obvious consensus about how to deal with hate speech, but you can start to see it emerging. People would like to encourage speech as much as possible, but when speech results in a potential imminent danger to another person, then there's a consensus that that's something that should be restricted. In the United States, the classic argument is you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. But at international level, the question is, can you stir up hate by speaking against somebody who has insulted a religion, who has insulted Muhammad or the Quran, or damaged the Quran? All those accusations are frequently made, and sometimes they result in, as I say, in huge, complicated cases where people spend years in jail. And indeed, there are many people who are in jail for blasphemy and apostasy right now.
Well, we just in the United States had to deal with, over the last, I think, 30 or 40 years, just burning the United States flag. There's a lot of people that did not like that at all. But, the Supreme Court says you have the right to burn the flag, and that's free speech.
In the United States, that's true, yeah. But if you happen to believe in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, and you say something that someone sees as an insult to Muhammad, or you desecrate the Quran, that can be a charge of blasphemy, which, as I say, can carry the death penalty.
Not a humanist value at all.
not a humanist value. And it's just interesting as you break these things down and talk about things. So when people are talking about hate speech, they'll talk about how you can restrict hate speech. But one of the criterion is if you're going to have a law against something, penalties should be proportionate. So what is a proportionate penalty for blasphemy or hate speech? And when you get into the sort of nitty-gritty of exactly how a law should be crafted, it leads to a discussion about how a law should be written or not written. And that's an interesting process, especially when you have it with somebody who really disagrees with you.
So it's like proportional is like I could disagree with you and you disagree with me. Okay, that's proportional.
But
if I disagree with you and you say, okay, I'm going to take my gun out and shoot you, it's like, okay, that's not very proportional.
No, that's true. And it's almost on a monthly basis. If you keep your eyes open, you can find an example of someone somewhere in the world who has been accused of blasphemy and is put in jail, and sometimes for an extensive period. And often it's something that is a questionable act, and you start to wonder, is this actual blasphemy? Were they intending that, or is this just a personal vendetta? You don't really know. Is it something that's done for a political purpose? You can bring in questions about whether having a blasphemy law on the books is something that allows efficient working of a civil government. Can it be used against an opponent? And sometimes it is. So you can bring a lot of value discussions into talking about blasphemy and apostasy laws.
Is there an easy way for a humanist to say, okay, I'm against the apostasy, I'm against the blasphemy? Easy for a humanist to say, well, I'm not religious, so I don't believe in the religious exemption of saying, okay, I can't say anything against the Bible, I can't say anything against the Quran, I can't say anything against Muhammad or anything else. How does a humanist, what's the easiest way for humanists to say, this is my value, this is our value as humanists, that because there is a little gray there, about how proportional it is. How does that get crafted? How do people even know that they're allowed or not allowed to do that?
Yeah. Well, again, I think the answer to that comes at a lot of levels. Part of it is participating in local groups where these issues are discussed, where you can have one-on-one conversations like you and I are. Part of it comes from being politically involved and telling your elected representatives what you think about these different issues at either a local level or a national level. Part of it is being involved with humanist organizations that have people that make a special effort to change the world in a way that's more consistent with humanist values. Although I hate to make a pitch, joining an organization, financially supporting an organization is really, really valuable. In order to do political lobbying, it takes money. So if you believed in humanist values at the level of the United States at a national government level, sending money to the political action committee that's associated with the Committee for Freedom, the Committee for Free Thought Equality, that's something that you can do that's really worthwhile. You can.
There's a number of national organizations.
You can do it through ACLU or other organizations, depending on what you believe in and what particular values
Freedom from
you
Religion
have.
Foundation. Yes,
Yeah,
that's
Freedom
another
from Religion Foundation is another excellent one. I'm a lifetime member, and I send them a little money each year, and I try to keep up with what they're doing, and I support them. You can also express your opinions to the leaders of those organizations and make sure that the things that you see are important are on their agenda, that they're aware of them. You can let people who are more focused on these issues just be aware of things that are happening in your community. So, for example, when you see a lawsuit that's placed by the AHA or the Center for or the Freedom from Religion Foundation, those usually are started because a local member says there's a problem in my community. And so just being politically aware and knowing what your rights are and having an idea how the way you think things should happen is a good way of promoting humanist values at a government level.
So just by being a humanist, saying you're a humanist or an atheist or skeptic or pro-science, just acknowledging that and saying that's who we are, or that any particular person says that they are, they have that effect that trickles down not only to their city, their state, their federal government, and also to the UN.
No, yeah. Simply being out and saying that I have secular values and I vote is something that's a really valuable thing to do.
We got these little buttons now. I'm a secular voter.
I'm a secular voter, right?
So you consider yourself secular, right?
I'm a secular voter.
You consider yourself atheist?
I consider myself an atheist.
A humanist, obviously. We talked about that. A pro-science skeptic?
Well, I'm a professional scientist, so all scientists are fairly skeptical.
Well, that is lost on a lot of people, that they don't understand that scientists are, by nature, very skeptical. That's how they first go at it.
No, I think that's true. And people often don't understand the value of sort of a human perspective of science, because science is a very human enterprise. And that as scientists get together, what they're trying to do is take advantage of observations in order to better understand the world. And in no case, in no discipline, do we really have an adequate understanding of the way the world works. We don't understand how the mind works. That's pretty obvious. We don't even understand simple chemistry. We don't understand how proteins fold. There's so many things we don't understand. There are constant revolutions that are going on. The whole genetics revolution and appreciating that DNA was genetic material was a huge step forward. Yet in my lifetime, we've seen the way that understanding has evolved, and that it's not just genes, but it's epigenetic phenomena that are important. And so dissecting and understanding those is simply another step. And I almost feel like it's digging a hole as you do science. The more you dig, the more you understand, the more area you have to understand.
And the sides keep coming in on you.
and every once in a while they do. I think that's one of the interesting things that happens in science. I don't know if you've read Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but he makes an argument that periodically in the scientific enterprise, there's a complete change in the way we think about things and understand things. And that's certainly true. The advent of relativity is a classic example. Physicists in the 1800s thought they had really sort of figured out physics, and it was just some details. And then all of a sudden we found that the speed of light was constant, and people had experiments that showed that. There was actual data that proved that was true. And all of a sudden, how does a wave go at a constant speed through the ether that they thought existed? And so that just led to whole changes. The whole changes, in particle physics. It constantly happens that we have new ideas that are bigger and smaller ideas, but things are constantly changing. And I think that's also true of humanistic ethics, in that as we progress and make time and people come up with new ideas and society changes, we end up with new ethical problems that we have to think about and we have to work through. Again, if you go back a couple hundred years, the whole idea of slavery was a religious debate. Some people thought that,
scientific reasons for it.
Now there's a general consensus that slavery is not okay. All right. So I think that's real progress. And I think there are a number of areas where we really have progress. Likewise, there are situations that are occurring right now because of the way society is involved that we really don't understand what our next step should be. So as we understand more about biology and have a better understanding of biology, how should we use that understanding?
We need a lot more scientists to figure this out, don't we?
Well, I think we need more scientists. We need scientists who can talk and explain the basic principles so people understand what the problems are, but then they can talk about it in terms of humanist ethical principles. So often when something new comes along in science, the response of many people is to say, oh, we can't do that. And that was the response, for example, when we could first do in vitro fertilization. Oh, no, that's not natural. We can't do that. And because the ethics that existed didn't know how to deal with it. But now slowly we've gotten to the point where we have a better understanding of that. We're more used to it, and we do have ethical principles about how in vitro conception can be used, in vitro fertilization. And those kind of problems are going to continue. Now that we can do more in modern genetic engineering, the advent of CRISPR-Cas, where we can modify not only human genes, but genes in the human germ line and have some control over future generations, becomes an ethical dilemma. What do we do?
Well, we're mostly germs, aren't we? We got certainly a lot more germ DNA and we got real DNA.
That's true. Human beings carry around a lot of bacteria and fungal DNA as we walk around. But I'm talking about the germline in the sense of the reproductive capacity of human beings, the genes that we pass on to the next generation. Because if you do a genetic mutation in an egg or a sperm, the person comes from that genetic mutation will carry that on and pass it on to the next generation. So you've really made a permanent change. That's something we've never had the capacity to do before. Is that something we want to do or not? I think the only way to talk about that is to have a careful discussion, to have people sit down and who understand it and think about this and how does it fit into your humanistic values.
I can see it right now, the Supreme Court, they're in there, kids suing their parents. It's like, why'd you give me a third arm? It's like, well, we thought it'd be useful for playing basketball, but you'd be a good basketball. I don't want a third arm and stuff. But there's going to be lots of these kind of questions in the future.
And I think that's continually happening. That's why one of the reasons we have so much turmoil and so much disagreement, because there's an evolution of society. In terms of the way society is structured, how much money do we have? How much mobility do we have? What's the role of women? All these things are things that have been continually evolving through history.
And it can seem very overwhelming for like a humanist to say, oh, look at all this stuff that John has been talking about this whole time, talking about all these different organizations to be involved with, all this scientific information that's going down. There's values that apply to the medical field, to civil disobedience, and to economics. There's all these things. How does a humanist wrap their head around all this stuff? Where in terms of religion, they got kind of it like given to them, so to speak.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that humanism has to come to grips with more strongly than it has in the past. And we're beginning to do that, in that humanists are now really getting more involved in education of children. When I first realized that I wasn't a theist, it's sort of a crisis, because as a child, when you're brought up as a religious child, you're sort of given the set of things that you should do. And why do you do these? Well, mom and dad told me, but also God told me, so this is the way you behave. But then when you lose that belief in God and religion, you think, well, how should I behave? When you become a humanist, you have to think, well, what are the ways I should behave? And much of the answer, I think, we already sort of hinted at, in that the way you deal with how you should behave is by thinking about it and by talking to other people and learning from other people. So one can go back and look at the literature and information and the thought process of other humanists. You can read books, you can be educated. For example, the Secular Humanist Society of New York put on a course called Humanism 101, which basically studied humanism. What are the tenets of humanism? Where did it begin? How do humanists think? How does it relate to other religions? And so you can become educated. And so I think one of the things that humanists have to do is provide an opportunity to teach both children and young adults and old adults more about humanist and ethical thought. And it's
Sunday school for humanists.
and although some of the principles can be simple, it takes some effort to really think them through and start to apply them to your own life. The idea that we want to try to maximize humanist potential, how does that apply to the way you educate your children? How does it apply to the way you work at business when you go to your job? Is your job an ethical one? Is it an unethical one? How can you be ethical in the way you deal with other people at work, with your customers, with your suppliers? All these
bosses, subordinates, all that.
Yeah, and so all those are, I think, humanist issues that you can talk through and work through. And so one of the things I'd like to see evolve in the humanist movement is more of an orientation towards communication and discussion about humanist ethical issues.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what we're talking about it today.
Yeah.
This is what they're going to see on the internet.
No, that's true. And there's so many things where you can't possibly go out and learn it or figure it out on your own. For example, I mentioned the Humanist International. So one of the efforts that HI made along with the AHA was to put out a book that is essentially called the Religious Freedom Report. And what they did was go out and look at all, I think, 187 countries in the world, and essentially tried to score each country in terms of their ability to allow their citizens to have religious freedom. And what were their strengths, what were their weaknesses, and essentially created a score. Pretty well. better than many, but not the best.
Top half.
and it's interesting to go and look up a country. Again, it's online. One of the things you should do is go look up your favorite country. How does the United States compare to Germany or to Saudi Arabia, which is probably one of the worst in the country in the world right now. But it's interesting to see what are the sort of tenets if you start to analyze countries in terms of their ability to promote religious freedom or freedom of expression, which are the ones that do it really well and which ones that do it badly, and why. And it's just starting to understand that problem is something that's a real value. But you can't do that on your own, and that's why people who have thought about it and had these discussions have a lot to offer. There are lots of books and things on humanist ethics about how to behave and what principles and values one should hold to.
I've definitely seen a lot of that since I've become non-theistic. I've become an atheist and humanist and secularist. I've seen that there's a lot of books and a lot of stuff that people can read and look at, but I don't think I can get to all of it. There is so much of it, but there's also some subjects that, let's say, I have an interest that there's a humanist point of view, but it's not something I personally like to say I'm interested in. But I know it's important, so I have to rely on experts. So how does a person say, okay, how do I figure out who that expert is? Who do I follow? Because sometimes we follow somebody and we think we're going the right direction, and all of a sudden, well, that person's got problems, so I got to go to another expert, or I got to go somewhere else. How does a humanist, you're an expert in the medical field and stuff, so how does somebody say, okay, how do I look for somebody who's an expert?
To a large extent, I think you have to rely on yourself to make judgments, and I don't know if I have any kind of general principle for that. but people who have put considerable thought into an area, who are respected by other experts within science, I often will get advice from people who have accomplished something, somebody who has done something that is of value. So if I'm looking for somebody who is an expert, or I want to understand more about genetics or epigenetics, what I look for is somebody who is an accomplished scientist who has made discoveries in that field. And so that means that I think that because they've made discoveries, they must have a good understanding. So I tend to trust them. So within the scientific field, that's the way I do it. I think within the humanist field, there's not exactly that type of ability to judge. But again, you can look for people who have led good lives, who have put effort into studying how to advise others to live good lives, who have values that are consistent with yours, and try to read about how they think and choose. In many cases, you can't go into any great detail, but you do have to take advice. So when it comes to the politics of how you educate children, you can't become an expert in that, but you have to listen. But often you have to make a decision with too little knowledge and too little certainty. So that's one of the things we have to live with as humans.
Well,
but pick people that you trust, that have made a study and put some effort into it, who are acknowledged by their peers as people who have thought about it.
So do we look at it the same way that I've seen it in other religion, like, well, this one's a Christian scholar on genetics, or other people out there that promote themselves not only in their particular field, but that they promote themselves as religious. Do humanists have to look at that too, saying that, okay, there's a basic humanist principles that if somebody's following and they're an expert in that field, I think I'm going to be interested in them. Yeah. Do we actually promote it that way? Do we say that, oh, this one's genetics and he's an atheist humanist, scholar, or he's an atheist human, but he's a scholar in genetics and stuff. Do we follow somebody like that? Do we look for a humanist, or we just say, okay, well, we're looking for somebody who's just good in that field and well respected?
Within good science, I think religion simply doesn't have very much of an import in the way people work in their day-to-day lives for most of the people who are good scientists. There are examples of where people who have a religious predisposition have tried to assume scientific credentials, where their decisions are based more on revealed truth than experiments. A good example of that is the idea of creation versus evolution. Mm-hmm. Creation now has kind of become a bit of an outmoded term now, and that people have seen that it's sort of lost its battle. So now intelligent design is becoming sort of the more common term, but it has a lot of the same arguments and same values.
But for the average person being at home, they're actually looking at it and saying, well, mm-hmm. They're arguing with their friends, their family, mm-hmm. people that they know, or people at work, and saying, well, this guy is an expert in this particular field and he's religious, so that's why I follow them. And for somebody who's a humanist is saying, well, I don't follow that, it comes off as an unsatisfactory response.
Yeah, I think it's unsatisfactory. Currently, the head of NIH, for example, is a religious man. He's a very good scientist. The two don't really have too much of a bearing on one to another. So I really think, in a sense, these are sort of two different areas. You can have expertise in a particular discipline, but you can also have a sense of values. What are the things that you find important to you? For me, the important things are humanist values. Democracy, the freedom of the individual, the ability of a person to reach their potential, to create an interesting, diverse society. Those are things that I see of value. Those don't come out of any particular discipline. I don't think they come out of science in any way. In a sense, that they're sort of basic principles that I've come to, and there's an agreement. But then I apply those principles in terms of how I look at decisions about how things should happen within society. You can't change the rules of genetics or economics on the basis of the values you have. Indeed, most people will have very common values, I think. They may argue about the appropriate government policies to achieve economic growth. There are people who are conservatives and people who are liberals who have very different viewpoints. If you're an active state liberal, you really believe in the responsibility of the state getting involved. A conservative may think a minimum state involvement is more important and it should be on the basis of the individual. That's an argument that is very difficult to gauge in terms of the development of that discipline. There's probably some truth in both points of view. But the question of values is really has to do with people generally think that it's a good idea to try to educate your children, to have people be financially secure, to people have medical care. The question is, what's the best way to do that? And those are things that are, I think, not distinct from the values are distinct from the path to achieving those values. So I think you can have legitimate arguments about the path to achieving those values, and you can have legitimate arguments about values. For some people, there's a real value in following God's laws, right? Since I don't really believe in God or any of the 5,000 or so gods that are currently believed by various people around the world, that kind of value doesn't hold any weight for me. And so I can only do things on the basis of values of believing in human beings and the way human beings can control their world. And that's all I'm left with.
Well, I mean, it gets to a point that I think that I'd like you to make is that, okay, if somebody's looking at this in the future, and you're looking at them in the camera and you're saying, this is what I want you to realize in your future, that humanism in our day and our time is this, and we want it to be that in the future. So what do you see as that future ethic or that future way of looking at the world that you would like to tell the future?
This is like when I was a Catholic, I used to love Teilhard de Chardin. You probably have read some Teilhard de Chardin, who had this idea of an omega point, that we're all achieving this end point.
Yeah.
Since becoming a scientist and reading the philosophy of science and Karl Popper, I no longer have that view. I don't think that there's an end point. But I think what you want to do is embrace the value that we're going to be able to do better in the future, whatever better means. Mm-hmm. One of the most influential books for me when I was making the transition from being a religious person to being a humanist was written by a guy called Julian Huxley, who's of the Huxley family. Oh, yeah. And he coined a term called evolutionary humanism, which kind of melded the idea of evolution and humanism. But he argued that human beings have a sense of sacred, or things that they think are important. And we all have a sense of sacred. Babies are sacred. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like an automatic response we have. Seeing somebody do beautiful art is something that's sort of sacred. It's just a value that is intrinsic, I think, in almost all human beings. And he argued that evolutionary humanism is just changing and evolving our values so that we can achieve those things that are a sense of sacred over time. And those things are probably going to change, just as our sense of art and what's beautiful changes. Things that humans value now are going to be different what they value in the future. But I think the process of appreciating that what we do and how we act should just be aimed at trying to maximize the ability of humans to enjoy their lives, and for humans to have an interesting society where the maximum number of people can do what they want to do and be creative and lead interesting lives, is something that is of general value that's going to be true for a long time. The details of that is going to change.
Well, right? Scientific method, if we're talking about a real basic understanding of the scientific method, that's not going to change any time in the future, as far as I can see.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I like the term scientific method, but it's kind of a scientific process. It's a social interaction where people doubt and argue and make observations and try to make better models. And that's going to continue over and over again. And I don't see that ever really coming to an end, or at least I don't see how it could ever come to an end.
And I think that was my point, is that mm-hmm. there are some very, very basic principles, such as going through this process of looking at the world and checking it out and having other people double check you to say, is this right? Does this work? Is it something I can turn around and have action upon based off this knowledge that has a better result for me or humanity or whatever? I don't know if that's going to ever change.
Yeah, I don't think it'll ever change. But there are some things that are ambiguous enough that they'll be with us forever. I said, the idea of a baby being sacred is something that we all have almost automatically. The idea of a baby growing up to be a human being that's flourishing and doing something really interesting is something we all value. You all love it, when a kid graduates from college and goes out and gets their job and they do something interesting in that job, but no matter what it is. Whether they're composing music that's inspired by the Alaskan wilderness, or whether they're making a scientific discovery, or they're generating a better way of delivering health care, or making it easier to make a purchase by using a bank card that's more secure. All those things are cool. People are able to do something that contributes to a more interesting and better society.
And not everybody has to have those particular big dreams or those big potentials. A lot of us are just ordinary people, just going through life, doing ordinary things and stuff.
Well,
but we're enjoying ourselves. Or that's another important aspect, I think, to the future, is that we have a life well lived.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thing when you talk about humanist values. To the idea of flourishing and you're doing something you find worthwhile. And different people find different things really worthwhile. I found being a scientist and trying to make discoveries worthwhile, trying to educate the next generation of scientists is something that was really good for me. On the other hand, for other people, there are a lot of other things that are really worthwhile and valuable. Being in the military and trying to ensure international peace is something that is really valuable. We can't have a good democratic government without a good military. So people want to do that, that's absolutely fine. If you want to go out and become a woodworker and make beautiful cabinets, that's absolutely fine. That's a real value. You want to make people look beautiful by styling their hair or designing their clothes or fabric, that's fine. But I think everybody should feel that one of the things that is an important part of their life is that they're contributing to other people and doing something of value to other people. When I was trying to think and working as a lifeguard, when you have a lot of time to think, especially on colder days, out there, what are the values? What do you want out of life? Well, one of the things I wanted out of life is to have a career that I felt satisfying and was interesting. And you think, well, what could that career be? In high school, I had no idea what I was going to be. Yeah. Eventually, you figure it out. But you think about all these possibilities. And I think I could have been happy doing lots and lots of different things. But everybody finds their own path. And I think it is a humanist value to say that everybody should have a career or a life work that is really satisfying to them and that really adds to human society. Whether you're a grade school teacher or a college teacher, whether you're a shoe designer or a sales clerk, all those things are of value. And if you feel like by filling that niche, you're making society better and making people happy, that'll make you happy. Because one of the basic things I realized in terms of thinking about ethics and human society is that we're a member of society. That's one of the things that's so uniquely human. There are lots of species have a little bit of a social interaction, but human beings do it so much better than any other species. Our ability to interact and gain from other people, to pass on knowledge. People write things down 500 years ago and all of a sudden we pick it up and learn it. We write things that other people will enjoy in 100 years. You write a novel in 1980 and in 2500 somebody will maybe be reading that and enjoying it. We're just amazingly social interactions. We get together and we can make so many things happen. We can put a man on the moon, or we can do horrible things sometimes too together.
Well, the future might be mining our trash dumps and saying, what the hell are they thinking by doing this?
That's true. And you don't really know the right path necessarily.
Yeah.
But you have to do the best you can, and you have to have some faith in it. So, people who
humanists have some faith.
People who are religious often talk about faith.
Yeah.
And I liked the idea of faith when I was younger. And I still have sort of a sense of faith. I have faith that human beings can make a better society. And if I didn't have that faith, I'd probably have a harder time working towards that society. But the belief that it's possible is something I just believe. There's no evidence for it. Mm-hmm. We may be vaporized in another 20 years.
Well, I think we can have some evidence that there have been some improvements. So we've seen some track record. Are we perfect society? No. Are we on a journey? Yes. Mm-hmm. But we got a ways to go as human beings to at least get a lot more people happy.
Yeah. No, and a humanist, I'm really sort of delighted by this argument that we're making progress. The argument that there are fewer people who are in poverty today, that there are fewer people who die a violent death today than ever before really make me feel better. And I like to think that that trend can continue. But scientists know that trends don't, you can't assume that that trend is going to continue. You don't really know. But nonetheless, sort of faith that we can do better is something that drives me. And by putting effort into making society a little bit better, if everybody does that, I think society will get better. At least that'll maximize our chances of making things a little bit better.
Well, I have faith in you, John. I definitely have faith. You've done tremendous things and keep doing amazing things, and we look forward to seeing what you're up to next. And as you proceed on and stuff, it's been amazing. I really want to say thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us today. It's like a little over an hour and stuff. Chatting away, we could probably go all night and stuff about different things, but I appreciate you spending a few minutes with us, and thank you very much.
Well, knowing you, Rich, we will have these talks going on over and over again, over many evenings.
Hopefully drinking with atheists with a few beers, we'll be able to do that. So thanks.
Right. Okay, thank you. Take care.